Hi, AP Psychology students, and welcome back. Today we are continuing with our Thinking and Intelligence unit. We're going to focus on the judgments, decision-making, and choices that humans make, and some of the different, things that get in our way when we make choices every day. And this relates to Learning Objective 2.2, so we're still focusing on how psychological concepts and theories account for thinking, problem solving, judgment, and decision making. And our essential questions are: what factors influence how we make decisions, and how can our own biases lead to bad decisions? So when we talk about decision making, right, ultimately humans believe that we make good choices, right, that we make good decisions. If you ask somebody, like, do you make good choices? People generally say yes. People make pro-con lists, people weigh the options when they have choices, people maybe research different ideas or concepts, right? And ultimately, we would like to think as individuals that we're good at making choices. However, in the end, we find that a lot of human decision making comes down to intuition. So it comes down to what you feel like is the right choice or what your gut tells you to do. And even when you don't think you're using your gut, oftentimes what we're using are these cognitive biases that limit our ability to make accurate choices, right? So you take a look at this little graphic here, and this guy's asking if you want an apple. It's a very easy choice. And we use a shortcut. We use a heuristic. We say like, ooh, I've had apples before. They're delicious. Yeah, I'll take an apple. As opposed to really thinking about like what we've had for breakfast this morning, what the risk of poison is, how many calories we need, if the last time we had an apple it was good or bad, glucose levels. I mean, all the things that I guess one could consider don't normally make it into our awareness. Right, so in this video, we're going to talk about some of the different issues that come up when we make these flawed decisions. So the first thing is the availability heuristic. So availability heuristic is the idea that when we make a choice, we tend to choose the option that most readily comes to mind. So what does this mean? This means that if somebody asks you to make a choice about something, instead of considering all the possibilities, you really just choose whatever example comes to your memory or comes to mind in that moment, right? Whatever you recently heard or saw, whatever has been a vivid experience in your mind comes to mind, and then you make that choice. So these are kind of silly examples because I know a lot of times people have talked about this in the past, but they are great examples of how we make choices that are flawed. So if I ask you which is deadlier, or which what you're more afraid of, or what seems scarier, right? Planes or a car? A lot of times people are more afraid of planes than they are of cars, right? They will be afraid of getting in a plane crash. They are afraid of flying, whatever. You don't often hear like, I have a fear of cars. You do hear like, I have a fear of flying. Especially since we just had this horrific plane accident where I think it was like 65 people died. Now it's very fresh in your mind, like, oh my gosh, plane crashes are scary. Statistically, you're much more likely to die in a car accident than you are in a plane accident, right? And so even though statistically there's all the different car accidents that happen on a daily basis all over the world, we think about planes because that memory comes to mind. And then which is deadlier, shark versus hippos? So if you see where I'm going with this, you might say, okay, it must be hippos. And yeah, it is hippos, actually. Hippos are more deadly, or are deadlier than sharks. But hippos are not like sexy, right? So we're not going to have like hippo week or hippo-nado, like Sharknado and Shark Week, and then we've got Jaws and all the different kind of things that you think of. When you're trying to figure out which is deadlier, you think of, okay, what are all the examples I know of sharks being deadly? Bing, 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 bing. All these examples come up to mind. What about hippos? Crickets. You don't have any examples. So you say sharks, even though it's hippos. Next, we have the representative heuristic. And again, this is a heuristic, so it's a shortcut. So when we're choosing anything, right, we're making a decision, we tend to pick the option that best fits with our stereotype or the prototype, so like the most common example, instead of using actual probabilities. So if you take a look at this picture here, you've got jury members who maybe make a quick judgment. They're like, oh, this guy must be guilty. Look, he's got tattoos, whatever. So they kind of like judge him if he's a criminal based on what the stereotype is for a criminal. So here's an example that's not quite as serious as making a judgment about a criminal. So a new student walks into school. The student is wearing all black. They have dark makeup on, and they are wearing a band t-shirt. So you ask yourself, which is more likely to be true, or which is true of this student? They like rock music and are introverted, or they like pop music and are outgoing. And a lot of you, maybe because you know where I'm going with this, are like, oh, okay, fine, they like pop music. But realistically, if I'd asked you this question kind of out of context, you probably would have assumed they like rock music and they were introverted based on what they were wearing, right? Because that outfit kind of fits the stereotype or prototype of somebody who has those characteristics. All right, the next kind of bias that we have is something called the gambler's fallacy. So this is the belief that even like that a random event is more likely to happen because it hasn't happened recently. And this is kind of like a subset of the representative heuristic, because ultimately what you're doing is you're trying to make your choices seem balanced, right? Like it seems like when things are chance, when they're 50-50, like heads or tails, that you should have an equal amount of heads or tails, and that would be balanced and 50-50. But ultimately, 50-50 just means the probability is half and half, and if you toss a coin 10 times and you get all heads, it's still 50-50, right? So the idea here is that people tend to believe that like if they've been getting all red, the next one must be black. Or if a bunch of girls have been born recently into their family or friend group or whatever, the next one must be a boy, right? If I've lost a lot of lottery tickets, the next one must be a winner, because that would be balanced. But that's just incorrect. The probability stays the same no matter how many times you've lost or what decision came before. Belief perseverance is our inability to accept new evidence that conflicts with our existing beliefs. So you have a belief, right? And you read some stuff about it, and maybe you found some evidence to support your belief. But then you find new evidence that contradicts your belief. And what happens is most people just stick with the original belief. So an example of this is vaccines causing autism. So there was a very, very popular initial research that was done, I believe in the 90s, where they said they found a link between autism and vaccines. Well, that research was like kind of in the mainstream for about 8 to 10 years. And it turns out that that research was flawed fundamentally, and it was debunked and retracted even by the scientists who wrote it because it was so flawed. However, people still believe that vaccines cause autism because of that initial research, even though we now know that that research was flawed and there's other research that proves the opposite. Next, we have framing. So framing is just a way that we pose a choice, right? It's the way that we say things, the way that things are presented to us, and that can impact the choice we make, right? So if you see frozen yogurt and it says 80% fat-free versus 20% fat, and you're trying to make healthy choices, you're probably going to choose the one that says fat-free, even though it's the same, right? And you can also utilize this kind of with parents and their reactions, or with others. You might say like, okay, so you got a C on a test, and maybe you think your parents are going to be upset. So you show up home and you say, oh my gosh, mom, like this test was so hard. I like really felt like I got an F. I really felt like I got an F. I was like really upset about it. I didn't know anything. And your mom's like, wow, like you should have studied more. And then you're like, but I got a C, right? And maybe that's going to go over better than if you just showed up and you were like, I got a C on this test. I don't know. Just something to think about. All right. And last, we've got what's called the sunk cost fallacy. So this is the tendency for human beings to stick with the decision, even if they're upset about it, because they've already invested time, money, and effort into it, right? So the idea is like, if you were starting something that day, would you do it? Maybe not, right? A project or an idea, but you've been working on it for months, and so you keep working on it and working on it and working on it because you feel like you've put effort into it. A student starts writing an essay and they realize the argument doesn't make sense, or it's very difficult to write about, or the topic's really hard, or they can't find, but instead of just changing and throwing out what they have and starting new because that would be easier, they stick with it because they've written 2 paragraphs, right? They feel like they've already invested the time and energy into it, and that this is just not true, that like it doesn't matter how much time or energy you've invested into something, that leaving it and starting something new, if it's not working, is not a waste of time or energy, right? It's just doing the next right thing, making the next right choice. All right, so today we talked about some errors that we make and factors that influence our decision making, and ways that humans often make very flawed choices. So make sure you stop here and answer these essential questions. That's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.